In this hand, I'm holding the secret to getting closer to those birds and wildlife you're photographing. What is it? Stay with me and find out. Hello and welcome to 5-Minute Photo. I'm Bill Ferris, and this is Nikon's TC-14E version 3. Well, what's that? It's a teleconverter. That's what the TC stands for. The 1.4 stands for a 1.4x conversion factor, and the 3 again means that it's version 3. The E means it's compatible with the Nikon's electromagnetic aperture E series lenses, these newer lenses that Nikon's been developing and releasing. So what does a teleconverter do? Well, it mounts to your camera lens, and it fits between the lens and the camera, so it mounts as well to the camera body. And what it does is it converts or extends the focal length of the lens it's attached to. For bird and wildlife photography, that's a good thing because it helps you get closer to your subject. I typically am shooting birds, for instance, with a Nikon 200 to 500 millimeter, a 5.6E lens, and with this 1.4x teleconverter attached, it becomes a 280 millimeter to 700 millimeter lens. So let's take a look at some photographs, and while we're looking at those photos shot with this teleconverter attached, I'll talk with you about some of the factors you need to consider if you're thinking about getting a teleconverter. So while the big plus is that the teleconverter brings you closer, the price you pay is in aperture, is in the amount of light your lens is able to deliver to the sensor. Now the 200 to 500 millimeter has a constant aperture of f5.6, but with the teleconverter attached, it's stopped down one stop to an f8. That means less light is getting to the sensor. This is important because for wildlife and especially bird photography, especially bird and flight photography, you're using fast shutter speeds. I'm often shooting at 1/2000th of a second or within a third of a stop of that in order to freeze the motion of the bird in flight. And at that shutter speed, and even in good light at f8, the ISO starts to rise. It starts to get close to that 1000 threshold. And let me say this, I'm often shooting with the Nikon D610, which is a fantastic low-light camera body. However, with animals, again, with wildlife and with birds, one of the things you have to consider is how much cropping will you need to do in order to get a well-framed final image. And what I'm finding shooting with that 200 to 500 millimeter and the D610 and this teleconverter is that I really have to pay attention to making sure I'm filling the frame and that I'm not having to do too much cropping. And why is that? It gets back again to that light factor. The widest aperture with the teleconverter is f8. I find the images to be just a touch soft at f8, enough so that I close down the aperture to f9, which adds enough sharpness that I'm satisfied with the images I'm getting. But again, at f9, there's even less light now getting to that sensor. And so what I'm finding is instead of shooting at 1/2000th of a second, I'll often dial back to 1/1600th or 1/1250th of a second in order to make sure that my ISO doesn't get too high. I try to keep the ISO at 1000 max or thereabouts. Maybe I'll allow it to get up into that 1400 range, but I really like to keep it at 1000 so that I have room to do a bit of cropping if needed. If I have to do too much cropping, even though that D610 sensor is very good in low light, the more cropping you do, the more you magnify the obviousness, the apparency of any noise in that image when you're shooting at anything above your base ISO. And so the TC-14E version 3, the version 3 1.4x teleconverter by Nikon, I'm enjoying using this. I find it's great for perched birds or static subjects, and I'm even occasionally getting good results for birds in flight, as you've seen from some of the photos, but there's a big grain of salt you have to take with that. There's a real narrow range where you can be at an aperture setting and a shutter speed setting, and the light needs to be really good for you to get those good results. So keep that in mind if you're considering a teleconverter for your photography. Well, thanks for watching. I'm Bill Ferris, and I will see you next time on 5-Minute Photo.